Let's finish up the 1920s by moving on towards the end of that time period and talk about the economy and then the causes of the Great Depression. In 1919, cotton was 35 cents a pound. Just 1 year later, it was 17 cents a pound. So you know enough about sharecropping, tenant farming, farmers having to borrow money from the bank to know that that much of a drop meant that people were in debt or even further in debt in a really, really big way. The boll weevil, here he is, does arrive in southwest Georgia in 1918. Before that time, before 1923, Georgia produced 1,750,000 bales of cotton. But after the arrival of the boll weevil, Georgia produced less than 600,000 bales. That's an amazing difference. In addition to the boll weevil, between 1925 and 1927, there was a drought in the southeast. There was no such thing as irrigation during this time period. So if it didn't rain, crops just died. Georgians left farms and moved to towns and cities because they just could not make it farming. The Great Depression had already started in Georgia a long time before the stock market crashed in 1929. Between the boll weevil and the drought, things were pretty terrible. Now, the boll weevil does have one advantage in that it forced Georgia farmers to diversify. What's going on in industries? You know about textile mills. All those former farmers, sharecroppers, tenant farmers are trying to get work inside in the mills. That was a difficult transition. They had to adjust to working inside as opposed to outside and working on a schedule underneath a manager where they had had a little more independence if they were on a farm. But mill work becomes harder to find during this time period. The, the machinery has become more efficient, and changing fashions like the flappers require less fabric just to make people's outfits. And it's during this time period that the first artificial fibers are invented. Rayon um, comes along during this time period. Georgia still leads the U.S. in production of naval stores. Granite and marble production are going on. We've talked about the beverage industry sort of being centered here in Georgia with both Coke and RC having Columbus connections. The Tom Houston Peanut Company also is started in Columbus. That becomes Tom's Foods. They're still here. Let's talk specifically about the causes of the Great Depression. On October 29th, 1929, the stock market crashed. By the end of the year, for example, General Motors stock had gone from $78 a share to $8 a share. We'll talk in class about exactly what that meant for the investors when we say the stock market crashed. We'll talk about um, exactly what that meant for people. Now, we're going to discuss 7 different causes or things that led to the Great Depression. First, agricultural and industrial overproduction. Stick with me here. During the 1920s, farms and factories produced more than people could buy. So if people can't buy all of something, that leads to cuts in production, which leads to factories cutting jobs, which leads to unemployed people having less purchasing power to buy things, which leads to more cuts in production, and it's just a downward spiral. But it started with overproduction in the 1920s. Too much buying on credit was also a factor. During the 1920s, people borrowed money to buy cars and homes, and then they couldn't repay the loans. People had also speculated in the stock market. Stock prices had been going up, so people thought it was a good investment and they just didn't think that the stock market would ever go down. And so they invested their money where earlier they were more conservative with their money. Inequity in income distribution was also a problem. The prosperity of the 20s had not been distributed equally. Half of the US was barely getting by, the wealthier had gotten richer. The number one song of that year was Brother, Can You Spare a Dime? We'll listen to the whole thing tomorrow. High tariffs were also a factor in the lead up to the Great Depression. Tariffs, we've talked before, were taxes on imported goods, but that hurt trade with other countries. Americans couldn't afford imported goods, and then those countries couldn't afford American goods. So it worked all the way around to hurt the economy. High unemployment comes from those cuts in production. Factories needed fewer workers, and so they laid people off. Well, then those people don't have money to spend, which just leads to more cuts in production. And last but not least, there was no protection during this time period for bank deposits. When customers couldn't pay back loans, banks began to fail and close. Also, banks had invested in the stock market. And when it failed, all that money that they had invested was gone. And so customer savings were, were gone. If a bank failed, all the money in it, even people who had been saving their whole lives, it was just gone, which was just devastating to lots of people who had put their savings in banks. And that sums up the causes of the Great Depression.